A lot of modern climatic patterns influence where plant species can grow, but there also are some patterns that extend back into time. So I'm talking about this as ancient geology. And Wisconsin and other Great Lakes states have a great pattern of having been influenced by glaciers. So you've probably heard about this if you're from Wisconsin or this area. You've probably heard about how the glaciers are contributing to the landforms we have in this area. So what the glaciers do as they move through is they push rocks out of their way, just a massive amount of removal of soil, rocks kind of scouring the earth. And the end result of that was to get rid of a lot of species. So if your plant's growing in an area that gets covered by glaciers, this traces back to 10,000 years or before. This is a pattern of the ice ages, so glaciation. No existing glaciers right now in Wisconsin, but ancient, going back about 10,000 years. We get into these glacial regions, the ice ages, and they get names. So you can see on here different coloration for the different ice sheets that moved across. And turns out actually this peach color one was known as the Wisconsin glaciation. And one interesting pattern we have in Wisconsin, and this region extends a little bit into our neighboring states, there's this area known as the driftless area, where the glaciers basically went around that area and left it without any glaciers, and also without the effect of scouring the land and without the effect of removing the plant species. So we'll kind of see what the effect was of that. So this is a modern glacier, not in Wisconsin, but kind of gives you a scale for this ice sheet. So this massive amount of ice moving through at a very slow pace. We have the term, right, we refer to glacial pace, at a glacial pace. But over thousands of years, these things advanced and retreated a few times. And as they advanced, they basically, we think of it as more or less killing all the plants that were there. So they removed them, uprooted trees, removed soil, pushed it ahead of them, and anything just for the duration, the long time that the glaciers were in place, it was generally thought that these plant species, whatever was left of them, didn't really survive that. And so if plants are removed by glaciers that advance, well, what comes in later? Well, while the glaciers are in place, the plants are gone. When the glaciers move away, that opens up space for the plants to move back. So we have this term known as refugia. Refugia or refugium is singular. Just a fancy way, it's a Latin version of refuge. So when the glaciers were in place, plants can't grow, and they instead survived in these areas we consider refuges or refugia. And then from those places, they were able to come back into the areas that used to have glaciers. And I mentioned the driftless area. Here's a little more precise map of the driftless area in Wisconsin. And it gets that name because this idea of drift is like the evidence that the glaciers have pushed some rocks and soil around. And so you can find patterns of earth that was moved by glaciers. And this area is called the driftless area. It doesn't have those patterns that show us the evidence of glaciers moving through. So interestingly, as I showed you before, there was several different glacial advances that all missed that driftless area. For whatever reason, they went around the driftless area, meaning that for the rest of the state that was missing plants during these glacial events, these areas would have had intact soil and potentially intact plants, maybe not thriving, but potentially surviving over that time, seeds or whatever, and then able to come back in that same location. So we see some plant species actually that are characteristic of the driftless area in Wisconsin, and I'll highlight some of those. And the other patterns are shown on here. So till of moraines. Moraines are like ridges of where these glaciers kind of ended their advance, and you can see the pattern. You can almost envision a lobe of a glacier coming through and pushing all that rock up into what we have today as these rocky ridges. And not too far from us, we have the area called Kettle Moraine. Kettles referring to these little pocket lakes, and then the moraine, the ridges, and a really neat feature for scenery and also for finding interesting plant species in that area. So after getting pushed away, plants came back. We have evidence for where they came back from. Sometimes we use for evidence the evidence of where these related plant species, or sometimes the same plant species, where they are growing today. Another form of evidence, a couple other forms of evidence, is that we could take cores of pollen. So digging down into the soil of many thousands of years, soil deposited. One thing that gets deposited along with soil is the dust of pollen. So pollen falls onto the ground. Year after year, layers of soil build up, and the older pollen gets buried deeper. And so scientists who do that sort of thing can reconstruct the age of the pollen. And so this is a map showing a variety of different locations where they've done soil cores. They dig a cylinder of soil out, and they analyze where they can find these pollen grains. And so these are basically the most recent places where these pollen grains were found, and more recent locations are tracking with areas closer to that location. So basically reconstructing to show where these pollen grains could have come from based on soil cores, and a similar pattern emerges if you look at the recolonization of the same species genetically. This pattern of the blues and the dark blues, this shows that they don't have a lot of genetic diversity in the north. And so this is what we expect from population genetics, is that populations moving into a new area don't bring with them as many individuals as if they had a longer time or a larger population to move. And so moving kind of an advancing force of relatively few individuals means that they were carrying the genetics of their ancestry, which might have been around this area. So these blue in the north of the glacial area, LGM is the last glacial maximum. North of that area, blue, and living relatives south of the maximum, still today with that kind of blue pattern. Tells us basically where they came from. That was the big take home here. So presumably, while there were glaciers here, these species were not growing in that area, and they came back from somewhere. They're blue today. Genetically, they must have matched the blue areas in their ancestry. So this is just another very similar pattern showing recolonization of a species from the red zone into the blue zone. Not too much different from what we saw before. So genetic similarity, genetic patterns of which populations are most closely related. So getting pollen from soil cores, this is kind of a nice graphic of the same environment changing over time. So from a period of time when there were glaciers in place, so glaciers and also a rather cold environment around there, not a lot of plants, and then over time, several phases here of plants coming back. And this was actually from a study that was able to get DNA out of the soil cores. So kind of matching up the evidence from pollen and the DNA to reconstruct the species that could be found. So this has the nice advantage where you don't have to find the pollen necessarily to be able to reconstruct what species were there. So some of the patterns, I'm just going to show you some patterns. We have an interesting assemblage of species that ended up in Wisconsin. A lot of times, presumably, they were displaced from the whole state or almost the whole state, and they probably came back from areas that didn't have glaciers on them during the last ice age. And so one of the patterns we see is so-called appellation. So it's basically plants that are found in Wisconsin that have affinity or same species living other parts of the country that weren't affected by glaciers. So this is a species here, this Diphasiastrum, found in Wisconsin today, but also found in basically the Appalachian mountain range. And that's kind of its pattern of where it probably came from into Wisconsin. Another pattern we see, we moved off to the west now, here's Wisconsin. And we have a pattern where we have some species in Wisconsin that were that are otherwise native to the Great Plains. So part of that would have been glaciated, but farther south here, no glaciers, one potential source for these species getting back into Wisconsin. A little bit loose pattern here, but sometimes you get a species that's more of a Mississippi embayment kind of area. So the lowland area of our country that is draining into the Mississippi River. Not quite, this pattern isn't quite tracing that exactly. It's distributed through a lot of different water features. This is the water lotus, but some of them are still found today in the Mississippi River. Some interesting patterns were sometimes our glacial recovery after the glaciers came from farther away. So a lot of these places would have been covered by glaciers, and their living relatives are far out or in mountain areas, maybe over here in the Cascade Ranges or the Rocky Mountains. We see a little bit here. So potentially a rather far recovery to get from those places back into Wisconsin. Some of them are rather rare. This one's got a distribution in the driftless area and otherwise found just a little bit in, I think, Ohio here in New York. This one actually, Noveboracense, is referring to New York. So this is a monk's hood from New York that also was found in driftless of Wisconsin. Coastal plains, lowland area, heading towards the Atlantic and sometimes the Gulf Coast. Species there, sometimes an interesting a split between this area where they're more abundant and then a few populations in Wisconsin. This is a relatively rare plant in Wisconsin from a family that's actually a lot of tropical species in that plant family. We've got just this one. Then some more northern species. There were actually, over here, there's this glacial free corridor that about tracks this area. So it's not purely just north-south with the glaciers. There were actually regions that were actually north of us and still not glaciated during the last ice age. So kind of a more northern distribution today. And then from that, you can see a very rare plant in Wisconsin, but one that kind of matches either high altitude, it's called alpinus, that means alpine or high altitude, and then also found in some more northern areas. Some limited just to the Great Lakes. Don't know if I could tell you where these colonized from. Little pockets of safety, I guess, around the glaciers. And I'm gonna take a little break here.